Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 65. Today's guest is Alanna Airitam. Hey there, folks. So, something I've been thinking about lately is heroes, about what it means to have heroes. And by that, I don't necessarily mean like superheroes, although, I guess that could be in there too. But what I'm talking about are role models, inspirations, people that you look up to. And mostly I'm thinking about it in the context of the arts and literature. I think that artistic and literary heroes is a topic that a lot of people have been thinking about recently, mostly because it seems like every week or so we find out that some person that we looked up to turned out to be an abusive creep. And look, I'm not going to try and take it away from you if that's hard, I think that disillusionment can be very difficult and that's real. But, I also think that it's important to keep in mind how much harm these guys have done, and how much art the world never got the chance to see because of the harm that they did. But, I guess what I'm thinking about isn't so much any specific person, but really the idea of having heroes at all. I think that when you talk about a hero, you're talking about someone that you're holding up as an example, as an ideal, that this is a person you want to emulate. And I think that a lot of us turn to art and literature looking for wisdom, looking for someone who can teach us how to be. I certainly know that I do. In some ways, I think that this show came about because I was looking for a teacher. I mean, at least partially because of that. But more and more, I feel like that's not a fair thing to ask of another person or even of a work of art. We can definitely learn from each other. I think most everyone has something we can learn from them. And that's especially true of the people who are able to crystallize their ideas and feelings enough to actually make a successful piece of art. But the truth is that nobody really knows how to be. Nobody can really tell you that. Ultimately, you have to take all the little bits and pieces you pick up along the way and figure out for yourself what it all means and what kind of person you want to be. And I don't know, but maybe if we didn't put people up on pedestals in the first place, it'd be harder for them to hurt others, or at least it would be easier to hold them to account, when they do hurt others. It's something that I'm still working out for myself, what I think about all this, but this is sort of where I'm at right now. All right, on to today's show. So as I mentioned, today's guest is Alanna Airitam. Alanna is a photographer based in San Diego, and as you'll hear in just a minute, I first became aware of Alanna's work via a short documentary produced by The Artist Odyssey. Now, if you've been listening for a while, you've probably heard me talk about The Artist Odyssey before. Some of my past guests have been featured in their films, including Alex Conkey and Trinmai. And I also spoke with one of the filmmakers behind The Artist Odyssey, Barbarella Focus. That was in episode 36. All of that is just to say that I really love The Artist Odyssey's work and I recommend checking them out. And a great place to start is with their film From Harlem to Harlem, their profile of Alanna, and her portrait series, The Golden Age. If you can, go ahead and pause this episode and watch that video. I put a link in the show notes. It's 19 minutes and it will give you a really great background for our conversation today. Basically, The Golden Age is a series of portraits in which Alanna portrays Black people using the style and lighting and visual tropes of Renaissance portraits. And this is her way of sort of fighting back against the kinds of negative media representation of Black Americans. Now, I really loved this work, and I knew as soon as I saw it that I wanted to talk to her about it. So I was really pleased to get the opportunity. We also talked about her Being Heard project, which was also a portrait series. This one about giving people the opportunity to speak who, because they are marginalized, are often excluded from the sort of mainstream activist narrative. So there's links to both of those bodies of work in the show notes, and I do invite you to check those out. Also, if you will be in the San Diego area, images from the Golden Age are included in a group exhibition called About Face, which is currently on view at the San Diego Art Institute in Balboa Park. That show will be up through June 3rd, 2018. And it also includes work from episode 63 guest Morgan DeLuna, so I definitely recommend seeing it if you can, and there's a link in the show notes for that. All right. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod to live tweet the episode. And now here's my conversation with Alanna Airitam. So I was introduced to your work through the Artist Odyssey. Chris Fessenden is sort of a friend of mine, and he'd sort of emailed me and said, you should check out Alanna's work because it's pretty great and might make a good conversation. So I watched your film that you did with them, and it was really something. I really enjoyed watching it. I was sorry to miss the screening, but it seemed like it went pretty well.
Yeah, the screening was, it was great. I think it was, well, it was emotional for me because it was the first time I had seen it, and I had to watch it along with the audience. And there was a big audience there, actually. MOPA, I don't know how many seats are in that theater, but maybe like 200, 250 or something like that. But it was packed. It was almost sold out. So that in and of itself was surprising and emotional because I had no idea people cared that much about my work or the film. But then I sat there watching it, and they just did such a brilliant job of distilling my message down, like taking the 3 days of shooting that we did and just really keeping my message intact. And yeah, I thought they did a great job with that because you never know with editing how things are going to turn out. So yeah. It's can I have you just sort of intro the series a little bit? So it's your Golden Age series. Yeah. So the Golden Age is a series of portraits that I did last year. Kind of came through me like a freight train is how I like to describe it because it was not something that I had concepted before doing it. It kind of unfolded as I was shooting. And so it was a surprise every time that I would do a portrait. I was sort of given the next key to the story after I would edit it and look at it in context with the last one or the last several that I've done. And I started to see that, like there's a story actually forming here, and really starting to understand like what it meant. And there's so many different layers to the project. I have my own personal relationship with it and how it came about for me. I kind of like to call it sort of like a emotional vomit because it really came out of a super dark place for me, in a place where I was feeling pretty lost and starting to lose hope in humanity and, my purpose and why I was here, and just like not really fully understanding. I was in a toxic job and I was getting sick, like literally physically ill from being under the stress. And at the same time, hasn't changed really, but I was really affected by the amount of stuff that was happening in the news around police brutality. But there was never really any time to process it. It was get up 6 o'clock in the morning, get dressed, go to work, sit in the cubicle all day, sit back in your car for another hour, get home, eat, shower, get ready for work again the next day. And within that time frame, there's like zero room to actually process the realities of life. Yeah. And so it was starting to just wear on me because I'd get to work and there's no place for emotion at work. Zero. You cannot emote at work. So, I had to just sort of hold it all in and squash it down. And I was starting to feel like I don't know how long I can carry that, without having to put that energy somewhere. So quit my job, didn't know what I was going to do, but knew that that was not the answer. And so I just thought, well, if I'm not doing anything with my time, I'll pick my camera back up again and started the series. And it just was, for me, originally, it was a way for me to not just process all of that, but I think I needed to see my truth. Like, I don't see Black people the way that we're portrayed in the media, or, as these thugs and these animals and criminals and just all this BS that you hear all the time. And I just kept looking around. I'm like, I don't know anybody like that. Like, I just don't, that's not who we are as a people. I mean, you can take everybody individually from all backgrounds and races and, find the thugs and the bad apples. but you can't place a label like that over an entire group of people.
Right.
And that's what's happened to our culture from the time we were brought here. So I wanted to create what I saw is the truth, which is beauty and abundance and light and power and majesty and all of that. So that's, it was kind of a FU to, to all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like, over the past couple of years, something that I've been seeing a little bit more movement on, you know, that people are more willing to talk about how a representation matters, and things like how having diversity and inclusion, not just like in the portrayals themselves, but also behind the camera, you know, whether it's television or movies or art or, you know, even publishing, that having a range of different type of representation is so important, especially for people that haven't had that experience in the past. Do you feel like that's something that you've been seeing a little more of lately, or is it? Yeah. Yeah.
I've definitely seen, a difference. I don't know how long it's been going on, but it just seems to be more prevalent now than I think ever. And it's needed. I feel like in a way, it's a form of activism. And, you know, I think we've sat back and we've allowed other people to tell our stories for so long, and that's where stereotypes come from. And the reason why we have these labels like we do, I think, is because we've allowed other people to tell our stories. And that's true for women. That's true for people of color. That's true for people with different ethnic backgrounds or religions, whatever. If you don't take hold of the power to tell your own story, somebody else will. So you might as well do it and do it, you know, correctly, the way that you want to be seen, perceived.
That sort of brings up something for me that I always find very interesting, which is this idea that, you know, a lot of times when we talk about art, we're talking about what the piece or the series says, you know, like what the artist's message is. But one of the things that I find, you know, I like talking about that too, but one of the things that I find kind of interesting is the idea that not just what the piece says, but what it does. And it seems like with your work, especially this series, and not just this series though, because I was looking through some of your other work as well, that you seem to have an interest in art that is like accomplishing something. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah. You know, before I decided to just put all of my energy into, creating art, you know, I was in marketing and advertising for many, many years. And, you know, I would go to work every day and just wonder, like, what am I doing? Like, none of this makes any sense to me. This isn't meaningful to me at all. And so I thought, okay, if I'm going to really drastically change my life and take this leap of faith, I want to do something that has purpose. You know, like, we only live once, and I want it to be a meaningful, purposeful life. And so if I'm going to create, I want it to do something. I want it to inspire somebody to see themselves in a different way, or take action to speak up for themselves, or to create a platform for people like themselves. Or, you know, like, my bigger purpose is to make art more accessible to people who don't necessarily have the ability to get to museums or get a hold of a camera or a computer so they can edit stuff, or even know or see people that look like them, so they understand that they could do these things themselves, you know?
Yeah. I think that's something that a lot of times people don't really, I was going to say people don't think about, but I mean, I think what it is that some people don't think about that. You know, if you never see not just art that depicts people that look like you, but also you don't see people who look like you looking at art, right? Like, there was a thing about that in the film, in the Artist Odyssey film, talking about the space of a museum often feeling very sort of exclusive. And I think a lot of people for a lot of different reasons, can have that feeling about that space that, you know, this isn't a place that I belong. And whether that's something like, you know, traditionally people might think of that as sort of more of a class thing, which is totally legit, but I don't think a lot of people necessarily think about how that's also a racial thing, or other, you know, forms of ways that people can be marginalized. I thought that was a really, you know, getting people to talk more about that is pretty key.
Yeah. And you know, like you said earlier, I think it's changing now, which is great, but you know, I'm older and, you know, when I was a kid, I would go into those spaces and I never saw anybody that looked like me. I didn't know that I could do that. And I mean, like everything that I was told from society, from my parents, and I know that, you know, it was all coming from a good place, was, you know, that's not for you. Go get a real job, you know, like that's not for you. And so it was just echoed when I would walk into those spaces and not see anybody that looked like me, not see patrons that were walking around that looked like me, not seeing people that looked like me on the walls. And so what I was trying to do with Golden Age was also putting Black people in an art history context. And what's funny is that I have had conversations with some people about, I think that there's a little bit of a confusion as to my decision around doing that. And I've had people ask me about putting Black people in a European context. And I'm constantly trying to correct them and say, well, it's not about Black people in a European context as much. It's about an art context. And as Westerners, like, this is what we know art to be. When you walk into a museum, you're going to see portraits of people from the Renaissance with the ruffs and the whole bit. And so it was just a way for me to say, hey, we belong in art just like everybody else. Now, I totally could have put Black people in some African gear and stuck them on a wall, but that would take the whole art context out of it. You know what I mean? I felt like in order for it to make sense, there needed to be this connection between what we perceive as art from history. So
it's an interesting thing. Like, to me, one of the things that I was one of the kind of connections or comparisons that came to mind when I was looking at your work was Hamilton. And how with that show, like a big part of it is purposely taking people of color and inserting them into the historical narrative, and as a way of sort of reappropriating that story and saying, you know, we were here too. And we're not part of that traditional narrative the way that we're taught in school. And so, and it seemed like your work does a really similar thing. Are you familiar with there's a Twitter account that's called Medieval POC? No. It's pretty great.
Yeah,
it's
I'll check it out.
This historian who goes through and she shows different, some medieval and some Renaissance art that actually does depict people of color. But it's interesting because a lot of the people that the painters that she shows their work are people that are not known for, like, those aren't the paintings people know. So it's not even just that like Black people or other people of color didn't appear in the art at the time in the same style, even, you know, some of the Flemish masters or whatever, they were there. There are those paintings, but the knowledge that those paintings exist has also been suppressed.
Right.
That's so something like your work seems like I'm always interested in the concept of appropriation and how that plays with how it either reinforces or subverts a power dynamic in our culture. It seems like it would be sort of not necessarily missing the point, but it would be emphasizing a different point if the people were dressed differently in your work.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, yeah, I don't know. Appropriating to me means borrowing or stealing from another's culture. And it's kind of tricky with us because we were brought here from another country. You know what I mean? And so, for many people, many Black people, we sort of lost touch with our our rooted culture, like where we actually came from. A lot of us don't even know where we came from. We got to do an ancestry.com and realize like, oh, Ivory Coast. Hey, that's kind of cool. And that to me also feels sort of like, well, even if I do my DNA and I find out that I'm from the Ivory Coast, I have no connection to that. You know what I mean? I'm American. My family, they're American, you know, so this is just as much my culture as it is, you know, the white guy down the street. I belong here too, you know, so, I don't know how much appropriation is being done in that. We were here. We were here. We built this country. We literally built this country.
Yeah.
You know?
I guess what I mean by that is not so much, you know, what I think it is that sort of the historical narrative has originally been appropriated by, you know, white culture, right? And that they're the ones that got to tell the story before, and they, you know, historically, traditionally have written people of color and all sorts of other marginalized groups out of the official history. And so by saying, no, I'm taking this back from you, to me, that's an act of power.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I agree with you on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I misunderstood. I was getting all fiery.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, you know, like this thing of who belongs here and who is allowed to be here and who is entitled to feel like a real, you know, I'm making air quotes, right?
Yeah.
Quote unquote American, that obviously like right now, that's like front and center in our public discourse, in ways that, I don't know, like, I think it's funny talking to either white people or people of color about this whole thing. I find that like people of color are less surprised by what's happening now than white people. But I feel like it's not so much that any of us didn't know that this stuff was happening, but the fact that it's all right out there in the open now is a little shocking still, you know, or at least for me.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's hard for me to be surprised about it. It's difficult for me to be surprised because this has been going on forever.
Yeah.
It literally has been going on forever, and it hasn't ever stopped for people that look like me.
Yeah.
You know, I think if anything, we're just seeing it more like it's in our face more because we have social media now. So the minute something happens, we get the news, you know, the breaking news. It happens all the time. We're constantly under a state of stress, you know. So yeah, I think if anything, it's not new. It's just more pronounced, like you said, just because we've got access to it all the time.
Yeah, yeah. This sort of is a little segue into this other body of work that I didn't know about before a few days ago when I was sort of researching you a little more. Your Being Heard series. So this, what I was reading from the project, this sort of came out of this in sort of the aftermath of the Women's March kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was pissed off. I was mad for a number. I feel like I stay mad. I was mad because, you know, we're just coming off of the election at that point. So let me take you back. This was January 2017 that project happened, right after the Women's March. Yeah, and it was coming off of the tail end of the election. So I was feeling that, as everybody, most people were. And then the Women's March happened, and it was amazing to see how many people came out around the world. I was just floored, absolutely floored at the sheer number of people that came out in countries around the world, you know, for this. And at first it was like, yay, like we're doing something. And then it just dawned on me like, hang on, nobody ever comes out when somebody gets shot in their backyard with a cell phone.
Yeah.
You know, nobody comes out marching when a little boy gets gunned down in a park because he's holding a toy gun. So I was angry because I thought, what does it take? What does it take to shift this? What does it take to get people to respond to something that is literally killing us? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it takes. I feel like we've marched. We're ridiculed for marching. We're ridiculed for taking a knee. We're ridiculed for standing up and fighting for our lives. We're just like, we're not supposed to do anything except for sit back and just allow it to happen. And so how do you not be angry about that? So it just dawned on me looking around this women's march that there were a lot of women that were not being represented that day. Mm-hmm. And, I just do not understand how, as a society, we can say we want to make all these changes, but we don't want to come together and listen to the collective needs of everybody and address those needs so that we can all move forward together. If people think that the rest of us are just supposed to jump on board to make sure that white women have equal pay, awesome. But what about black women that aren't even getting equal pay to the white women?
Right.
What about the people that are being brutalized by police? What happens to them? You know, like we don't ever hear from what happens to disabled women or disabled men who don't have access to the same places that we have access to. Like it just doesn't make sense that we are so hyper focused on our own specific little problems, but we can't see the big picture for what it really is.
Yeah. You know, like a lot of people, at the beginning of last year, I felt very motivated to sort of try and get more involved. And I've been able to sustain that more or less throughout the year. I've been a lot more involved in activism, both locally and nationally. And it's a weird thing, right? Cause like you say, some of these marches, you go and it's amazing. You see so many people. I mean, the Women's March obviously was a high watermark in terms of turnout, but like the number of huge demonstrations over the past year has also been great. And so you see all this energy, but then like one of the things that I noticed, for example, right, is that we were able to get a ton of activity around healthcare, right? Around, which is like, that's important, mm-hmm. right? Save the ACA or single payer or whatever, right? Like that's something important. It affects all of us. But like when it comes to police violence, that like a lot of people get kind of squeamish. They won't show up for those demonstrations, you know? Same, even immigration is something that there's been a lot of activity around, but even that's like sort of less, mm-hmm. you know, the level of energy and activity around that. You brought up disabilities. Like we were lobbying our congressman to try and do something about a bill that was coming up that would hurt the Americans with Disabilities Act, and trying to get support, you know, grassroots support for that was really hard mm-hmm. compared to the ACA stuff. It's such a strange thing. You see all this energy and all this momentum, and yet if it's not something that's really obviously in one's own self-interest, it seems like people sometimes just don't care. Mm-hmm. Or at least if they don't, I think what it is that people, it's not that they would say, oh, I don't care about that. Like they wouldn't say that, but it's just that they're like, well, you know, I'm tired now. So, you know, I did my one thing and I'm going to do that thing, but not really seeing how that whole dynamic plays into it. It's exhausting. It is absolutely exhausting to be alive right now. Just to be alive. You know, I mean, think about it. This is unfortunate because this was going to be my second topic. But anyway, I got to think of something else. I mean, you think about what we're into right now, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a war on women. There's a war on people of color. There's a war on kids in school. There's a war on education. There's a war on arts. There's a war on health, your food, your water, your air. We are literally fighting everything right now. Just to wake up in the morning takes, bravo to you for waking up this morning. Bravo. Likewise. Thank you. I mean, because it is exhausting. And so I can definitely understand why people feel tapped out and like, okay, well, that doesn't affect me, so I can't put energy into that. I get it. However, I think that we're being really affected by, I think we're being a little manipulated here into having all these little internal battles to fight and these things that we need to focus on that we feel like we need to fix and address. Mm-hmm. First of all, there's no way that we're going to fix all this stuff. I just don't
not the way that we're doing this. We can't fight these individual little battles. It's the overall root problem that we need to address. And personally speaking, in my opinion, I feel like the root problem is that we're being made to look at all this stuff and hyper focus on all this stuff while they're just taking away all of our money and all of our rights and everything. They're just stealing from us. Those guys. They're just stealing everything from us. And meanwhile, we've got all these little internal battles and we're just struggling to keep our heads above water.
Yeah.
If we could find a way to collectively come together and address the root problem, I think all the other smaller problems, I'm doing air quotes, will take care of themselves.
Yeah. The problem, of course, is getting people to understand how, like, all of these things really are interrelated, you know? Like, it's such a strange thing, like, to have a conversation with someone who might be, like, for example, a really ardent feminist, but then doesn't really admit that racism even exists, you know, or that it's a problem. And also not seeing how, you know, racism isn't just a problem for Black people or Latinx people, or it's like a problem for white people too, right? Like, it affects everybody. The thing that heartens me is that I do feel like there are people having conversations now that certainly I never saw even in my 20s, you know, like when I was old enough, like I mean, when I was a kid, who knows, like maybe people were talking, I just didn't know. But like when I was an adult, even more, there are more of those conversations happening now, but it does feel like it's still not enough.
Well, you know, what's funny is because I feel like I've been having this conversation for a while, but while I was having it before it became the thing, I was just considered like a weird conspiracy theorist. You know, like, oh, there's that girl, like blaming all of them. But yeah, they are the problem. They are the problem. And for me, I always come back to, where's the money going? Like, it's all about the money.
Yeah.
It's all about money.
Yeah.
It has been from the beginning. Bringing Black people over to this country from Africa was about economics.
Yeah.
Period. Hands down. You know, stealing the land from the Native Americans here. Economic. Hands down. Like, it's all based in money. So if we go back and we look at where the money's going, this isn't about race issues. This isn't about feminist issues. This isn't about that stuff. This is about them taking money from us. This is about them putting us into positions where we are disempowered and having to be more and more dependent upon them to take care of us and tell us how to live.
Yeah. And that's one of the frustrating things about some of these conversations that happen, is that there are still people who kind of feel like that racism or sexism or whatever, it all comes down to just people's feelings, when it really is, like, just as you say, it's about the money. Like, and that if you, when you dig into the history of it, that a lot of the ways that, like, things like white supremacy have operated have really been not just functionally, but like explicitly to like do things to, for example, split poor working white people away from people of color, you know, who might have at certain points in time in American history looked like they might sort of join forces and realize that they were on the same side. But then, you know, the people in charge sort of very cynically deploy this race thing to split that up and when you look at that kind of thing happening, it's funny that you should use the word conspiracy theory, considering like what's in the news. These, like, yesterday, everybody except for Fox News was talking about the thing, and Sean Hannity is talking about pandas. Like,
right. Exactly. Yeah. Oh, like, man. I mean, if you don't even need to look that deeply anymore to see that this is all big hoax, you know, and I don't know. I can't participate in it anymore. I try not to as much as possible. I don't watch the news. I get enough. I hear it.
Yeah.
I hear it. You can't escape it, you know. I don't need to be in it. I feel like it's just negative.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm just trying to keep my sanity by doing what I know how to do, which is just create and talk about these things, like create a platform for myself where I can talk about this stuff, and hopefully that will resonate with somebody, and maybe they will figure out a way that they could take action in their own lives, you know. Really, the answer is to, I think the answer is to just go within. Like, we all need to just do a lot of internal work and get to a place where we are feeling good about who we are. And we have self-love, because self-love breeds compassion for other people. When we have compassion for other people, we're able to open our ears and our eyes and listen to what they need and address those needs. And I think that it can grow like that. But if we don't take personal responsibility for ourselves and how we show up for ourselves in this world, if we're looking for somebody else to fix it for us, we're just going to be waiting forever.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was another thing that from the Artist Odyssey film was that you had mentioned being surprised and a little overwhelmed by the response to your Golden Age series. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I was surprised because, well, first I didn't know that I didn't know I was creating this. So it was a surprise to me originally to realize what the project meant and like how deep it goes and the different connections that it has to art history and to me personally and to the people that I know. And I didn't know what I was creating. I really didn't. And so again, I know it has meaning to me, but then when I showed it to people, to see how it resonates with people and they have their own relationship with it, they get out whatever they need to get out of it. Personally, I just didn't know that was going to happen. But I think the most surprising part was how it's affected the people that sat for the project and listening to them. I was lucky at the film premiere, that most everybody from the series was there. I think there were only 2 people missing. And so at one point, somebody in the audience was asking questions about the subjects, and another person yelled up, like, you know, can we just have all the people that were here, like, stand up? And so they all stood up, and I invited them to the stage. And so it was great because they were able to answer the questions personally. And I was able to hear for the first time how it affected them and, the process of the work. So, for example, I would have somebody come to the studio and sit down, and we would talk. We would just have a conversation. And during that process of having a regular conversation, I would hear from them how they see themselves, you know, and then I would put my ideas together around how I see them. And then, so it's almost like we're creating this portrait together. I would ask them to go back into different parts of their life when they felt their most powerful and their most confident, you know, and bring that forward. And so I think that hearing from them when they saw the portrait in the end, a lot of them were saying things like they didn't see themselves that way, you know, or they didn't know that they could look like that. And so it affected them. I think it allowed them to see something in themselves that I was able to see, but maybe they don't see in themselves every day, a strength, a power, you know, and that's the biggest gift. You know, if they could take that and walk around with that every day, yes. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that really sort of speaks to the thing that you were just talking about, right? About being able to, you know, sort of take care of your own emotions first and have that sort of base of strength to sort of carry you through. I think, you know, and then that sort of gets back to the thing that I was talking about before about, you know, that the art is doing something. I think that's a really interesting idea. And it's a really sort of vital and necessary thing, right? Especially right now.
Yeah, it is. And, no, I feel extraordinarily humbled and grateful that for whatever reason, I was able to facilitate that message through the work. You know, I feel a little bit removed from it, and that it just sort of came. It was unexpected to me. And so, yeah, it really is a overwhelming and humbling experience for me, but I'm entirely grateful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we take a quick little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, I came with the topic that we had just finished talking about, which was kind of just taking responsibility for your own being and how you show up, and also sort of like the bigger issues at play here. You know, I think it's very easy to get very focused on what is just affecting you. And there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot. You can just dial in your problem of the day. You know, do you want it to be environmental? Is it your food? Like, what do you want to complain about? Because there's a lot to, you know, complain about. There's a lot wrong. And I don't know if there's a way to fix all the problems, but I do believe that solving the problem is not going to be a picking off the problems, like crossing the problems off the list, because I believe that those problems will just continue to grow. So it's addressing, like, where are these problems coming from? Where is the root problem? If you're sick in your body and you have a headache and the next day you break out in hives, like, don't you think that might be connected? Wouldn't you go back and say, well, okay, what's happening in my body that's creating all these other symptoms and problems? Like, you want to address the root problem, not just put a Band-Aid over your wound, right? Yeah. So that's just how I see things, is what can we do collectively to stop hyper-focusing on our problems that just affect us and understand that we're all being affected by the same thing and fix that.
You know, one of the things that I think is really interesting is, so like I've been seeing a therapist now for like 2-ish years, maybe 3, and that's been great for me. One of the things that I have found really interesting is sort of thinking about some of the lessons that I have taken from that process and sort of thinking about them in sort of a more systemic kind of way. And this is going to be a little...
No, I like that. Let me. Yeah, I'm with you. I'll go on that journey.
The thing that I think about a lot is when I look at this president, right? And he is just so nakedly fragile, you know, that like everything he does, you can really see it so clearly. Like it's amazing to me that there's anybody who doesn't see it, but apparently there are, right? That like every time he makes a tweet, it's because he's just like this black hole of insecurity, you know, and he just needs to do anything he can to make himself feel better. And that is mainly by shitting on and harming other people, right? Whether personally or through his business practices or whatever. And I feel like when we talk about root causes of things, that a lot of it comes down to the fact that the more privilege a person has, that the more sort of fragile people are, you know, that like on some level, people who are privileged kind of know that they shouldn't be, you know, and so that makes them defensive.
Ooh, do you think there's some guilt happening there?
I kind of think so.
Yeah.
And I part of this I can say sort of just as myself, like, you know, like I'm Asian, so I'm not like as privileged as like a white guy in my situation would be, but I am like, you know, I'm fairly affluent. I'm American. I'm a man. So like there are definitely ways that I'm more privileged than other people. And just even looking at my own reactions, my younger self, like sometimes I would have, when I was a teenager or whatever, would feel really defensive when people would start talking about men, And I think there's a way that's really driven by this fact that there's a realization, even if you don't want to admit it, that they're right, Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of gets to the thing that you were talking about before, that if you don't have that base of strength in yourself, then that's how you're going to react to some perception of criticism, of that you're going to be insecure and defensive and feel unsafe. It's the strangest thing, right?
It's wild. I mean, if you think about society in terms of a ladder and who's on which rung of that ladder, like Black women are probably at the bottom. And so as a Black woman, I have the ability, I've been given the gift to be able to see everything in front of me. I can see it all. I see everything. And so with that sight comes a lot of power. It's just choosing how to use that power. And so, you have to think about it. If you're on the bottom rung, everybody's standing on your shoulders. Everybody. Mm-hmm. So that makes you an incredibly strong, you have to be strong. So I definitely give it up to all of my Black women out there, because we have to hold up the world. Yeah, I think that when you're up at the top, you don't have to carry anybody. So you do get fragile. You can crumble if you want, because the weight of your crumble is just going to fall on everybody else below you. Yeah.
Yeah. That, and that thing that you were saying about having to hold up the world, there's this really interesting way that, sort of the popular liberal meme right now is like put Black women in charge of stuff, which on the one hand is like, well, yes, like let's recognize the strength of Black women, but also like, maybe like telling Black women that they have to do more work is not.
Yeah, I'm not voting for Oprah for president. I'm just not that I don't like Oprah, but I want somebody that can actually like make political decisions. She's an entertainer, and I think we have learned our lesson with that time and time again. How many times do we need to keep doing that? I don't think that we should be saddled with any more work. We should be listened to. Mm-hmm. I think that we should be heard more. I think that we have a lot of wisdom being in the position that we are, being able to see everything in front of us and having to carry so much for so long. I really think that, there's a lot that we could offer, and a lot of different solutions that we might be able to share, because we've had to hold it down. We've had to carry that. We've had to be strong. We've had to figure things out and survive in a way that a lot of people just don't understand, Single mothers living in poor neighborhoods. Are you kidding me? How? How? I don't even know how my, neighbor who's white and is a single mother living in downtown San Diego makes it happen. So I can't imagine, but there's got to be a strength and a power in there. And I think with that comes great responsibility and the wisdom that might be able to help people move out of this situation if we were able to hear people more. Yeah.
Yeah. It really, it seems to me like the thing that's lacking is empathy, and mm-hmm. that when you are very privileged, you don't have to think about what other people think or what they're going through. And so a lot of people, they don't even have any awareness that other people don't live the same way that they do, or that their problems are not the only problems in the world. Like, not to say that like rich people don't have problems, but there are other problems that they don't have to deal with, right? And like the thing that ultimately gets in the way of that empathy is this sort of unwillingness to be uncomfortable, the unwillingness to say, I wonder if maybe I might actually be part of the problem, and until you're willing to do that, then you can't even learn anything, much less, fix anything.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's so funny because back in early 2000s, I went to a Bioneers conference. Do you know about Bioneers? It's like a sort of like a sustainability conference that happened up in the Bay Area. And I saw Van Jones speak there for the first time, and he did a thing on he was basically trying to say that when you're poor, you don't have the privilege to think about recycling. Like, that is not on your list of things to do. When your list of things to do include feeding your kids, going to your 3 or 4, minimum wage jobs, keeping the lights on, basic survival. Like, recycling is so far removed from that. I guess what I'm trying to say is we all need to get on the same page and understand that, if you're a vegan, awesome. Like, go out there and explain to people why not eating meat is better for the environment or whatever, but also take into consideration that not everybody has the luxury to do that. That's a luxury for some people. It is literally a luxury for some people.
Yeah.
To do that.
Yeah.
So we have to take into consideration some people are just trying to survive.
Yeah.
They're just trying to wake up and make it through the day.
Yeah. It's one of those things where this is something I've heard a bunch of people talk about, that like people often don't realize how expensive it is to be poor, But even more than that, like I think there's a way that people want to separate all of these different issues, which is really what you're talking about. But right, like one of the big things that I often see coming up in sort of activist chatter is like, oh, I don't know, this group, socialist group wants to we need to talk about class first. And this other group says, no, we need to talk about race first, but without even really talking about how these things are sort of intertwined and how the history of it leads to the situation that we're in.
Right.
And so this thing that you were just talking about, I imagine there's probably people out there who, are, of more means, who might be critical of, of these people not recycling, without spending the time to try and understand, well, why is this situation the way it is? Why don't these people have enough money to think about the same things that I am thinking about? And that is a real easy way to again, drive a wedge between these communities that are really ought to be on the same side. But yeah, and getting people to listen to each other is really the trick. Yeah.
And it's not even that hard to hear that, because there is such overlap, and we do need to be talking about those gray areas in between, because that's where we all live. You know what I mean? Like, I could wake up in the morning and think, oh, it's another day of being a black woman. Like, ooh, hard for me. I can focus on that, or I can think, well, here are my problems, and I'm hearing other people's problems, and what can we talk about that's between us that makes sense for us to both have that conversation in between, because there is an overlap there. And if we can start talking about those between moments, those spaces in between, I think there's a lot in there that we could solve. But I think it's human nature to get, and there's a lot of fear happening, and I think that when you're constantly in a state of fight or flight, you're gonna resort to just I'm saving me. I'm just going to do me. But I think this is the time where we need to understand that it is not just about our own individual issues. Our issues are collective. And we need to start having those conversations more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing, that whole fight or flight thing, that sort of essential insecurity and fear, that even now, when you have conservatives who are in control of all 3 branches of government and most state level governments as well, they still kind of feel like they're some sort of embattled minority, and it's well, what would make you feel safe here? Maybe that's not the problem.
Yeah, I don't understand that. I was listening to something earlier about, I don't remember the statistic. I wish I had written it down specifically for this, but they were saying that we are now experiencing higher death rates for white men and women through opioid abuse, suicide, and something else. More than ever, and I think that they're leading the pack in that. And so when you think about what's driving people to commit suicide and check out on drugs, like what's driving that? If we're talking about the people who are the most privileged in our society and they're not even wanting to deal with this, come on. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a problem. Yeah. There's a big problem happening here, and it's not about race. It is not about feminism and the Me Too movement, and all these things are really important. So I'm not trying to take away from that or discount it at all. I'm just saying those are symptoms of a bigger problem here that needs to be looked at. Yeah. I don't know answers. I was hoping you'd have them.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Maybe some of your listeners has answers.
Yeah, sure. Write in. I kind of feel like on some level that there is a certain paralysis that some people have around, like, I don't have all of the answers to the big questions, so like I might as well not even think about it. But there, like having part of the answer, or having, just the ability to be open to it is still pretty big.
What's interesting too, though, is, looking at these little symptoms, sorry, they're not little at all. There's nothing little about any of these symptoms. Looking at the symptoms, the things that affect people the most, that can be sort of like an anchor for people in pushing forward. And when I mean pushing forward is not externalizing, but really just looking within, looking for your power within and showing up in your life the way that you want to show up. Meaning that if you're going to a job that you hate every day and you're coming home and you're miserable, quit your job. Find something else to do that's going to fulfill you, that's going to make you happy. You only live once. And I feel like if you could just start there with trying to make your life more fulfilling, more happy, more loving to yourself, like making decisions that really make you a better person because you want to be that person. Again, I feel like that just leads to that self-love resonates. It reaches out, and it causes you to feel more empathy towards others, to have more compassion towards others. And when you can have more compassion towards others, you can't help but feel like, I want to know that you're okay. What can I do to help you? I'm in a better place now. I feel strong enough within me that I can now help you. What do you need? And if we could do that, it just takes starting from within. I think that we are so used to externalizing everything. We spend all of our time on social media looking at what everybody else is doing. And then we hear what Beyonce is doing in the news. And we listen to what that orange dude is doing. And I mean, like, it's all very external. What about you? What about the things that make you happy? What about the things that drive you? What about the things that inspire you and motivate you? Like, that's what we need. We need that power that counteracts all that darkness. We need more light. So create more light, however you can, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah. For me, it's a little tricky because I feel like, I mean, even some of the things that we've talked about in this conversation, that it's sort of tough to find that balance sometimes between, like, certainly this has been true in my case, that having a greater sense of purpose and having more agency in my life and having more even just sort of awareness of why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. These are all things that have helped me really greatly. At the same time, like, I don't want to. So I think a lot of these things, like, are there are ways that you can be constrained by your circumstances, you know?
Sure.
And certainly that's something that we've talked about just now, like how some of these systems of the world can really sort of box you into these things. So I kind of think it's both, you know, like that it needs for us to find meaning and purpose and joy and calm and all of those things in our own lives, to find that inner strength, but that also, you know, like some, you know, person who's, you know, in some Midwest Rust Belt town who's, you know, dealing with opioid addictions and stuff like that. I mean, a lot of times people in those communities don't have, or at least they don't feel like they have options, you know? But at the same time, like, there's so much wealth in this country. Like, why don't those people have options, right? Like, so I feel like it's both.
It is both. And I didn't mean to be flippant by saying quit your job. I mean, like, we all have our own situations and circumstances. And trust me, it took me 20 plus years to quit my job, you know? So, I know that it's not just like, you know, just do that overnight. I don't mean it like that. I guess, I don't think the majority of us are in a place of absolute helplessness. I feel like there are people who are there and they do need us, the people that can move out and expand ourselves a little bit more. They need us to help them because the resources are not there and they are being diminished year after year. So it is really up to us to start to find ways that we can help people that are really truly in need. But it really takes us to own up to our strength and our power to be able to create that. You know, so the ones that can do.
Yep. And even at that, you know, like, I think a lot of the things that, you know, most of us are not helpless, but we're made to feel helpless. And realizing, you know, most of us have more options than we realize, but being able to get to the place of awareness of those options can often involve a personal change first. Right. And I think that's, where my point goes back to is, if you can look within and take that personal responsibility and make whatever changes within yourself to start living a life of purpose that is good for you, that makes you feel good. You know, I feel like then we're putting more light and power out into the world just by doing that alone. That alone is such a huge form of activism because they do want us to be powerless. They do want us to feel like we have no control or agency over our own lives. So if that's what they want, then why not say, F you, I'm going to have agency and control over my life. The exact same thing that you don't want me to do is the exact same thing I'm going to do just to prove to you that I can do it. It would be nice if, you know, sometimes it's not just, them, but it's like them. It's like the way that we do that to each other too. You know? Like, I mean, even just this, like the idea of, I mean, I don't know, like, so sort of bringing this back to your work, like, it's great that it seems like everything you've talked about has been that the reaction has been really positive. I could imagine, and I've seen reactions to other work that celebrates Black people, that like where people get like, oh, this is racist, you know, like that the very idea of a Black person feeling good about themselves is somehow violent against white people. It's such a strange thing. Like a lot of the conversation around Black Panther was like that, you know? And, you know, maybe some of these people who are saying this are people that they feel oppressed by other things too, but like it's not, it's like they're being operated on too by this system that we live in. They're being manipulated just like we are in a different way. In a different way, but they're still being manipulated. Yeah, I don't understand. I mean, I think where I could be wrong, but it feels like where you're going with that conversation is why is there racism?
Like why I don't, and honestly, what you were saying earlier about the guilt, people who have more have a sense that they have more. I think there's a lot of guilt in there. And so, when you oppress people over the course of generations and generations and generations, I think that I can only imagine you must carry around some form of guilt and shame around that when you see that this is still going on and the results of the oppression are still affecting people. There's still people that are shoved off into these super poor areas where there are no jobs, no food, no education. There's nothing for these people. And they throw drugs into those environments and then they round them up when that's the only thing that they could do to keep diapers on their kids. And then they round them up and stick them in prison. Like, how do you not feel bad about that? You'd have to be a complete, non-human to not have any feeling about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, to feel like, okay, well now we're going to give Black people power and see them come up. That's got to be very scary.
Yeah. I think it's yes, that is sort of part of where I was going. The other part is just that, there's this idea on some level that anybody else having something means that I can't, I have less, right? And that definitely plays racially. It plays on gender. It plays all of those ways. But and I don't want to equate this kind of thing, but even just something as simple as, this writer person that I know sees that writer person I know, their book is doing really well and their book is not. So they have to feel like, oh, well, that person probably is sleeping with somebody, or I don't know, it's you have to take that away from them instead of just being happy for them. And I don't mean to say that that's the same as systemic oppression and marginalization, but I feel like the impulse, that emotional thing kind of comes from a similar place,
Yeah, there's a severe sense of lack within our culture that for someone to come up, someone must go down. And I just don't buy into that at all. I just feel like there's enough for everybody. And I don't know, maybe that's very utopian hippie thinking of me, but I need
more of that.
Yeah. I just feel like, what would it be like? We've already tried it this way. We've tried it this way forever. What if we try, just for shits and giggles, what if we try everybody getting something, and see what happens with that? Because I just feel like there's enough to go around. And if we are all healthy, if we're all happy, if we're all prospering, could you imagine? Be crazy.
I don't even know if I can imagine it. Maybe that's the problem,
I can. And it's awesome.
Well, so there's one last question that I like to ask everybody before we close, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I wish I was better prepared, because I see work a lot, but then I don't necessarily remember all the names of artists because they're not necessarily people that are well known. I just kind of scroll through Instagram and I see a lot of stuff, and I just think that there's and I don't know, maybe this has to do with the whole social media sort of taking over, and that's, we're just always being inundated with information, but it feels like there's so much creativity happening right now. People are really putting out such great work. And I've been inspired by mostly the people that I've been sort of hanging out with here in San Diego. There's a lot of really interesting people doing some great things. I have a friend, Kirsten Imani Kasai, who is an amazing novelist, and I sit with her a lot and we talk about these same types of things. And a lot of her stuff that she writes about, she writes fiction, but it has to do with LGBT issues and women's issues, and she puts like a sort of a gothic spin on a lot of the stuff, which is really interesting. So it makes the messages coming in more easily to digest in an entertainment type of way. So I'm inspired by my friends, my friends that are doing great things. Skylar McCurran is an amazing speaker, and she is constantly advocating for women and other marginalized voices. And so I tend to draw my inspiration from people like that. And then I go online and I look at what people are doing, and I just see so much talent and beauty that's being created out there. And that alone is very inspiring. So I don't have a particular thing to answer your question. I just see a lot of hope.
Yeah.
I see a lot of hope, and I just like to remain focused on that.
Well, I certainly agree with you. I think that the best art that I've ever experienced is happening right now. And, that's part of the reason why I like doing the show.
Yeah.
I never want to just, fall back on an empty kind of hope where it means that you don't have to do anything, but it is nice to be able to have something to look forward to,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can see Alanna's work in the About Face exhibition at the San Diego Art Institute through June 3rd, 2018. There's a link in the show notes with the details, so do check that out if you'll be in the San Diego area. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find all of the show's contact and social media info in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. You can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back soon with a new conversation, so be sure to come back. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.